Hello, and welcome to IDpodcast with your host, Roger. We're bringing the best discussions and conversations to you about identity verification, AML practices, and much more. Thanks for tuning in.
Here's to a next episode of ID Podcast, and I'm joined here by a lot of people actually today because we thought, special circumstances need special content. So with us we have today Jeremie Kanter, Steven Armstrong, and Peter Murray with Richard Williams as well on the line. So first of all, welcome to everyone, and thank you very much for joining today.
Thank you, Roger, for inviting us.
Of course. Essentially, I just wanted to maybe start off. Obviously we have here people from operators. We have Richard, who's our expert lawyer, and we also have here people like Jeremie and Peter who have been dealing with regulation for a very long time. Let me just start off and ask first of all, what do you think the impact of this whole coronavirus that is essentially over us? What impact will it have on responsible gambling right now? What are the implications? What do you think might happen in the next few weeks? And essentially, how difficult is it really for operators to work on that?
I think from my perspective, the answer is simple: is we don't fully know at this point. I think it would seem to be some conclusions we could jump at, about the effect. Obviously, the stuff you can clearly see around the effect on revenues around sports betting, but then how that evolves into whether customers can migrate to other revenue streams and other products. We've not seen anything come out of it. I think you're right to focus on the responsible gambling side and safer gambling now, because for me, the actions we take over the next, say, 2 months could potentially define the next decade. We've got the UK Gambling Act review coming up. We're obviously highly politicised, quite toxic sometimes in its nature. So I think how we handle the fact that our customers are effectively in lockdown, and your view on this is going to be critical to what's going to happen, I think, over the next certainly 6 to 12 months.
From an operator perspective, that's obviously a question to you, Steven and Istvan. How hard is it really to, when you're obviously onboarding players and for your AML purposes? How hard is it right now to kind of have the right things in place? And obviously, how are you maybe dealing with the situation right now?
I think, William Hill, we're fully remote from home. I don't see that it's any different bar the fact that I'm not face to face with the teams. I'm not, the teams aren't together. There is an impact in terms of, review of thresholds and the type of customers that we're seeing in terms of, decision making points. However, I don't necessarily see that, it's had a major operational impact because, a lot of the verification stuff was done, in a way that you don't need to put a human in front of a computer. So that's the first point. And in this world now, with all of the technology and the remote way of working, take William Hill, for example, is sort of, AML work being done in the 6 different offices. There's only 2 of us in London. It's no real difference for me, to be honest, in terms of how we'll manage the teams. And in that sense, obviously, there's no travel, which, makes, face-to-face difficult. But actually, sometimes there's this big sort of perception that, everything's going to ground to a halt because we can't get in the office. Well, in some areas, I've seen higher productivity across the teams from them working at home. So, it could be said that actually there's less distractions and, better work could be done. So there's 2 sides to it really. But yeah, I'm not really seeing an impact across my sort of teams. Obviously we're seeing less sport customers, of course. But it doesn't change the work being done. A customer is still a customer. The product is a small part of what would cause that customer to trigger thresholds within, a risk-based approach. So for me, it's not necessarily a major change. It's just, we're having to utilize technology better.
And essentially, I mean, obviously, Jeremie, you are working nowadays as a consultant in the gaming industry, and obviously you are in touch with many different people. I mean, how do you see how operators have adapted right now, and what do you see are maybe the positives out of the situation right now that we will experience maybe in the next few months?
Well, first, the impact is really huge. It's absolutely huge. I see from clients, colleagues, and partners that the combination of the tremendous increase in activity that operators are perceiving right now, because this is happening, plus the work from home, which increase also a lot of the productivity, apparently, at everyone's operations. And plus the huge amount that is being put by the regulators that are sending more and more guidelines, guidances, laws in order to cope with the exceptional situation. This is an impact that is it's probably something that has never been felt by the industry in this amount. The amount of work, I guess the whole industry is working at least twice more and like concretely 100% more than it was working especially back end of January, beginning of February, with ICE, every one of us traveling, meeting, hugging, and everything. Now I can tell you that the impact is really tremendous, and this is just the impact in terms of workload and activity that is growing, and how the companies, whether the providers, the suppliers, and the operators are coping with that. But on the other hand, you have also exactly what you were mentioning, all those decisions about the future, what is going to be impacted, and think about a simple element of the near future, 2-3 years from now, around the lottery new license in UK, the fourth license for the lottery. This is radically changing the landscape of who is going to be able to offer and how to offer a new lottery product to the UK population, but all over lotteries are being all completely disrupted with this massive, complete retail closure, and realizing quite on the late that their digital strategy have been waiting for digital and mobile, have been waiting for way too long. All those things are extremely felt over the industry.
So I mean, just catching on that point, and to bring Richard in on this point, will we see operators essentially folding because of coronavirus? I mean, what's the situation there, Richard? What are your impressions currently on the obviously, let's say, the challenging circumstances for maybe also land-based operations and operations as a whole, I guess?
Yeah, well, I suppose you've got two different elements to this. I mean, you've got the operators, or three different elements. You've got operators who are purely land-based. So you've got the casino, the bingo groups who very much reliant on land-based for their income. You've got the hybrids, which are remote and land-based. And then you've got purely the remote operators. And it's interesting to look, I've been looking at the share price of these operators and statements made to the markets in relation to the impact of that. Obviously, everybody is affected in some way by the sports betting, the fact there is no sports to bet on. And clearly the land-based operators, particularly in the UK, where we've got complete closure of those premises, are going to be hit very hard. We've then got the hybrids. So we've got people like William Hill, GVC, who've already made announcements to the market. Their predictions initially at the sort of height of the start of the pandemic were to be very hard hit, particularly by land-based betting office closures. And with things like confirmation that the business rates relief will now apply to betting shops and casinos, that's been to their their benefit, and they've managed to mitigate costs. So we've seen announcements from GVC that costings that they thought and cash outflows they predicted initially may not be quite that high. And in fact, some operators who have that hybrid land-based and remote are looking to have sort of zero cash outflows. And then you've got the online only operators, so your 888s, who've also made statements to the market saying that despite the lack of sporting revenue, in actual fact, the increase that they've seen in casino and poker may actually substitute some of that revenue. It may not make up for it, but it may substitute for it. So in terms of questions about whether we'll see any operators go to the wall as a result of COVID-19, is perhaps not quite as extreme as the sort of land-based pubs, bars, restaurants who would be immediately hit. But yes, I do think we'll see more of this. In fact, I'm not sure if it's related to COVID-19, but I think we've seen some announcements in the press today about operators who are being hard hit and will be impacted by it. I think on the whole, large-scale operators who either have cash in the bank or who have credit facilities in place, which they're not drawing on, will be able to weather the storm. We know about the furloughing of staff, the government help in the UK. We know about the business rates holidays. We know, if necessary, there are loans and deferrals of VAT and tax options. So from my perspective, I think some of the larger operators are going to be well insulated from this, but certainly operators that were in any form of financial difficulty in the run-up to this episode will find that they will be at risk, yes.
And when was it made public essentially that the business rate reliefs were also being applied to betting shops, etc.? I mean, it wasn't like that from the beginning, was it?
No, there was about 3 or 4 days. The Betting and Gaming Council queried this with the government because originally the gambling industry was to be excluded from that help, or it would have appeared it was excluded from that assistance, the emergency business rate relief. So it's a business rates holiday for a period of a year, but it's now been confirmed, I believe, that that would also apply to all leisure premises. So it would include betting offices and casinos, bingo halls, and so on.
Well, I mean, obviously we know the media's, some of the media's position on gambling, and I guess that would have been, or is an easy target always to talk about that. I mean, literally today, there was an article, about, and I just quote it, and that's essentially the title of the article: "Fear of jump in problem gambling, a prompt backlash against industry." I mean, obviously, we, I guess, as people in the industry are happy for all, companies that are doing well under the circumstances. I mean, obviously applies to 888 as well, with doing it well. But, I mean, when you see those articles, I mean, I guess it's an easy target to have something else apart from COVID-19 to report on or to write about. I mean, Jeremie, how do you see kind of articles like that coming out in these kind of times? Do you think it's just going to make let's say more people volatile against gambling, and essentially might this be kind of like an escalator to many different other issues, or let's say response that we have?
I know how it should look like when people read those articles. It should definitely be the message that regulated gaming, regulated operations are the key to those situations, to those extreme times where everyone is much more at risk of harm, at risk of financial loss. And all the regulated operators, all the regulated providers, and the whole ecosystem that is regulated is working day and night in order to ensure that they are making everything in their power that they can to protect those players, for their own good, of course, and also, let's be honest, for the perception matter that they do not want to be seen as exploiting those situations. So the BGC guidelines of not mentioning the crisis in the marketing, or even guidelines or laws like in Spain and nearly coming like that in Portugal as well, of no advertising at all, is being respected, if not to the letter, or even beyond the letter, by the operators and the industry. And those that are actually celebrating are the operators that are not regulated, that are not licensed, and that will not have the enforcement of the law by the jurisdiction and the regulators once the crisis is over. And this is what those articles should help the industry or the government to understand.
Just diving on that one, because I think there was a couple of interesting things just on the press and perception. And one's obviously where that article you referred to came from, which was the Financial Times, which doesn't normally get involved in that level of debate. That's left for other sections of the media. But the other thing over the weekend, and there was two things, it was how the Betting and Gaming Council responded. And they came out both with messages. There was an article in the Racing Post from the CEO, and then Bridget Simmons came on BBC, and it was much more combative, much more on the front foot, taking exactly what Jeremie's just said there about, unregulated entities. It was looking at advertising. It was looking at quoting from facts. And I've never seen that before. I think, however that's driven on, whether it was COVID-19 or the way the Gambling Act's coming up for review, the industry does need to get on the front foot. And they were certainly sort of high profile, coming out, putting some of the messages out there of the good that the industry does. And I think we've all been advocating that for some time, but certainly this weekend, in line with that, they were pretty strong in their robust defence of the industry.
And I think just to obviously, give the mic to the operators themselves, obviously to you, Steven and Istvan. I mean, in terms of, from what I can see is that there is a even higher uptake now from operators to, an example, innovate, to strengthen your technologies to support you within, obviously, decisioning, within responsible gambling and within many other things. I mean, do you sometimes think that this is, always like handpicked just specifically for gaming? Because, certainly from my point of view, I cannot understand, because in the end of the day, you are doing, sometimes a hell of a lot more than any other institutions that are obviously dealing with people. So maybe just impressions like from you, what you think about those, constant, articles that always focus on the negative things.
I think a big example, sort of touching upon the last bit of conversation and just that question, is that, gambling operators are also taking a hit here. We don't have sport. So, there's people that potentially will lose jobs come the end of this in our industry. But, we held the virtual Grand National and raised 2.6 million for the NHS. And that was quickly out of the press as soon as it went in, which is disappointing really, because, the operators that went upon that didn't make a profit on that. We made no profits there. And ultimately we raised a hell of a lot of money, to the NHS, who are obviously the front line fighting this pandemic at the moment. So that's the first thing. It's the good news doesn't always stay in the news. And I think that's one of the issues. No matter if, and to say this correctly, pandemic or no pandemic, we still have licensing conditions, and the operators that have built their risk-based approach out, their thresholds, their AML, RG, etc., in the right way, can easily adapt in this situation to ensure that people aren't at harm. Either, one of the big indicators is clearly going to be, people spending all day online trying to gamble, whereas before they might be in work, etc. So, anyone who's built out a module that enables them to adapt that depending on their risk, when you set all of these thresholds across your business, be it for AML, RG, source of wealth, they're not a fixed threshold that then you aren't able to change. It changes depending on your risk. It will change depending on what sporting events are happening. It will change depending on, what goes on in the world or certain countries. Is it a certain country that's higher risk that's going through a certain situation? So, this is this is a global pandemic that means that actually you're adapting in one way, in a sense. But, somewhere like William Hill, it's easily adaptable because we have a model that enables us to adjust our thresholds in line with, what the risk is. And these articles, are tending to stir up that concept of, we don't do anything responsibly and we're all one. And I think that's the biggest problem is, a small unlicensed gambling provider is very different to the likes of William Hill, GVC, Kindred, etc., etc. And I think not enough of that is made in the press.
Steven, if I can just react to what you said, you were complaining at the beginning that the good news are not staying long in the news, but the good news are, even though very important, they are marginal events because they are outside of the core of the activity. This is funding, of course, critical funding for the NHS, critical sponsoring of what is happening in order to try and help. But at the end of the day, and at the beginning, it's not your core job. Your core job is to offer entertainment and to protect the players. And those are the news that they would want to see about companies. What are you doing in order to make sure that you are adapting those risk thresholds that you are mentioning and to protect the players? And I think it would be very dangerous for the industry to try and hide itself behind the news of sponsorship, of assistance and good feelings and emotions if they are not actively promoting how at the core of their operations they are rethinking what they are doing and they are completely redeploying their operation in a new way.
Sadly, that doesn't sell newspapers, and that's the problem with these articles. It's true. I could sit there and tell someone exactly what we've done since this pandemic started, what we've improved, increased, how our staff are working, resourcing, how we haven't, I've got effectively, I potentially have more staff working on my online because I have no retail network. So I could tell them this till I'm, grey and old, and it won't get published. And that's part of the problem. It's good news compliance is not something that is going to hit the front of a newspaper. And, that's our job as industry experts and these types of events, these podcasts, I'll give Rasmus a shout out. He always loves it. But the SBC Digital Summit type things, them type of things that are for us to engage, and hopefully some press comes out of that. But let's be honest, the type of newspapers that are writing generally these articles that Roger mentions, they're not going to write what we do well. And, we can only keep promoting that internally. We use the BGC, we use the GMLG, we use the different forums and try and work with our regulators to improve that. But I can guarantee you now that's not going to be on the front of sadly, on a newspaper to show all the good things, all the good funding, resourcing, education, everything that goes on in all of these, all of these operators. It's there. We're trying to sell it. We're trying to show the world. But sadly, we're not going to get that widespread good news in them type of forums.
Yeah, I think it's not William Hill's job. It's not Kindred's job. It's that you companies do some great things. It's the BGC's job. And I think personal view is that the industry body's not been particularly effective over the years. The change of tone over the weekend looks to be a lot more getting on the front foot, and we can't. You bang on. We're not going to get any kudos from the press per se, but what we have to do is keep basing it on fact. This is where research comes in so important. But certainly those messages of what we do, even if it's going to fall to some extent on deaf ears, has to be put forward by the industry trade body. And certainly in the UK, there seems to be that change of tone over the weekend. So that, let's hope that has some resonance.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, perfect. That makes sense. And I mean, from again, Richard, I guess it's it's more on the regulational side of things. I mean, do you think that all this will cause some sort of a short-term decision in terms of regulation, or what are the chances of kind of that we stay in the framework as we are, or might there be some things that will get maybe kind of I would say dealt with quicker than usually?
Well, I think time will tell, really. I think the Gambling Commission came out very early and warned operators that they would be expected to prioritise responsible gambling during this period. Obviously, the risks were significantly higher with isolation, boredom, family issues. And also, let's not forget, people potentially were furloughed on lower incomes or would be facing redundancy, loss of employment. And all of those things, as we know, can spiral towards problem gambling. So I think the Gambling Commission came out very early and warned operators about the issue, told them to place it in a prominent position in terms of their operation, not to take advantage of people in the situation that we're in. We've had recently announcements for the Advertising Standards Authority. They've set up a hotline for any advertising for gambling operators that consumers think is preying on people who are vulnerable during this time. So I think there's been a lot of an effort from the industry as well to make sure, that they do not get hit with the adverse press of preying on people whilst we're in this situation, and also being proactively responsible. So, I don't think there is any evidence, as far as I'm aware, of bad practice, malpractice at the moment. And I think time will tell whether the Gambling Commission needs to take any further steps. But, as far as I'm aware, those sort of warnings should be sufficient to make operators be aware of their responsibilities.
And Richard, I'd like to ask, because you mentioned about those guidances and as well as the affordability problem of the players, and you have some bodies like the All Parliamentary Party that is calling, I believe, for a restriction to £50 deposit per players, and we do know today that, especially on customer onboarding, but also existing customer, that a number of those players are potentially in a much more vulnerable and financially weak situation where they lost their income, they lost their work, and they have difficult days coming further. Why wouldn't it be then something sensible or realistic for the operators to say, until we do not know the situation of those players, we should actually put a concrete limit and like a very strict limit, like what maybe the APPB is suggesting? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it can be taken account of, and I'm sure some operators are thinking about that. We saw very early on, I think it was in Belgium, where fixed limits were on deposits or losses were imposed on operators from a very early stage. So I think some operators will be looking at that. The difficulty is, of course, that the operator doesn't always know the full position about the player. Some players may be completely unaffected by what's happened. In fact, some individuals, some businesses may be carrying on as normal, if not in enhanced financial position, because their outgoings will be significantly less, I guess, at the moment. So I don't think you can have a rule of a strict financial limit for everybody. I do agree with the arguments that have been made in the past that you should suit financial limits to the individual and not just impose a sort of mandatory fixed limit for everybody. So I agree with what you're saying, Jeremy, and I think that is sensible. But I think just picking a number out of the air, as it were, perhaps isn't an appropriate thing to do.
So the key is at the know your customer, KYC.
Exactly.
So back to you, Roger.
We're always talking about essentially the stuff that's going on to do responsible gambling and not to let people spend money. But I mean, obviously the money has to come from somewhere. And, when we kind of, looked at the data, from ID Now's perspective, from for whom we did the identity verification of someone, we saw a 40% uptake of, verifications for products like loans. Which means obviously a lot of people are looking at, loaning money, and I think we're always talking about responsible gambling, and there's only so much we can do from an operator perspective. So, I mean, I guess the question is out to everyone. Do you think that there should be more being done on also the financial services side on how to protect customers within, let's say, payday loans? I mean, obviously, payday loans are or should be history, but how do we make sure, I mean, as an industry, that we give that message out to also different industries, like an example, financial services, to do something on that? Because I mean, if you look at that number, I mean, 40% uptake in loans alone, and that's only the data from our side. And obviously there's some companies that do it still manually to this date. I mean, I would imagine this number is actually maybe slightly higher, but I mean, 40% is a lot of people if you look at the whole population, essentially.
Roger, I mean, we spoke about this in the past, and without the help from the financial services, this whole affordability piece will be nigh on impossible for any operator to get 100% right. And even then, it's still going to be, we need that information. They see the whole picture. If someone is spending all of their money gambling and not able to pay their bills, their bank can see that. And without that collaboration, as an industry, I don't believe we'll ever be able to totally solve this issue. And I've said this over and over again. We need their help. We need the information they have. We need to be on a level playing field in order that when if we're going down the route of the way the regulation looks like it's going, then to enable us as operators to perform the best, job, protect our customers in a way that would, mean that we were meeting all of these demands that, these articles, etc., push out to us, we would need to have that information. We would need access to that level of detail that only the banks can see. If someone's earning, I don't know, £1,000 and their bills are £900, but they're spending 500 of it on gambling, we can't see that until they go to a threshold point. And we have to remember that we are still within a risk-based approach. So how you would pick that customer up, some may say it's too late, but with the information we have to try and set a risk-based approach that enables us to, one, be able to do these checks. They cost money. They're resourced. These sorts of wealth type pieces aren't just, you can run a nice formula and it spits out an answer. It's human interaction into that. So without the financial services help, the affordability question will always have a part missing. Now, every operator and, the operators I work closely with in terms of the groups we're at, from William Hill perspective, are all driving to achieve the same, goal. We are trying to solve the affordability question the best way possible. We've got some very experienced people leading it. We've got groups of operators working together like never before seen in our industry. And yet, the same piece, anytime you ask one of someone in my position or someone who's head of RG, it will always come back to the same thing. Without that help and without being at the same table as the banks, etc., then we're almost fighting part of a losing battle to an extent, because we will never truly know that financial detail behind a person. We'll know everything else about them. We'll know everything they do, how they do, but we won't know that spend of money. Now, we then get into a moral line again, which then says, okay, when do other industries have to do it? When does, that become a point when I order, a 12 pack of wine off Amazon Prime? Are they going to start checking that I can afford that? And I haven't already ordered 12 from Tesco's. Not that I drink 24 bottles of wine in a week, but, it's about managing that level of, where is the line? And ultimately we're crying out to work with the banks as an industry and the financial services, and they need to sort of, start becoming more, more adaptable to that. We see the entertainment ban type thing on the, the Monzos. We've now seen that rolled out to some, more high street type banks as such. But not all of them are doing that, and not all of them are doing that. And to me, that's a good first step that shows they're thinking about it. If you test Monzo, you actually have to speak to an agent after you've stopped that. You then have an interaction with someone if you ask to lift it, which I think is amazing. They got staff in Monzo that are trained to have them conversations to see if, that's the right thing for you. And I think that's absolutely amazing. And if other banks did that, as well as being proactive in them interactions and sharing information with us, then I think as an industry, we'd quickly get it quite right. We'd be a lot better off.
Okay, I'll just add a point to that, Rog, because I think the point's really valid. I think we talk a lot around collaboration in the industry from whatever, but that's generally internal.
Yeah, that's our favourite C word, isn't it?
Oh, man, absolutely. But we are so far ahead of where we were 2-3 years ago. The big operators, both under their own steam and driven by the regulators, are collaborating more than they've ever done. So if you're a supplier like you and I are, we can provide some of the solutions. And it's how you pull that all together so that how we can collaborate, and Steve's point exactly right, look at the banks, look at other industries where we could start sharing this data, but then we get back into the area of who would want to do that with a gambling environment. So who's going to lead that conversation? Is it the BGC? Is it us is it operators? Is it the regulator? Because that challenge, the single biggest challenge around affordability, is a really difficult one to solve. So I think that point of how we can engage or at least work better with the banking environment tied in with the identity verification stuff is going to be key if we're meant to find something meaningful for an affordability perspective.
So do you think, as an overall, we will have to, as an overall, let's say industry, we would have to, well, not only this industry, it's not only gaming industry. Obviously what we're talking about right now, it kind of goes into everything really. So, do you think the conversation is now more rather than saying, financial services and gaming need to collaborate, that we need to think about, kind of different ways of identity verification, of introduce new standards? How do we kind of handle that? Because, as you rightly said, it's how do you do it? Do you have groups of different industries going into that? Or do we kind of, go into new ways to solving a problem? Obviously there is, I guess in this time, we all have a lot of time to think, and I think there will be some amazing solutions to come out of this crisis, because as we know, after each crisis, there is always a company that comes up with something amazing. But do you think it would be something that we're going to have to, think about new ways of identity verification? Is it outdated? Do we have to talk about, like an e-passport, like we said before? What really is that?
That whole federated identity where the customer holds the power of what's released is definitely where I see this, but this is a good way down the line. So the challenge for us all over the next months and years is we're not treated the same as everybody else as an industry. We do have extra challenges that we're going to have to rise up to and raise the bar. But that where we'll end up in a few years' time, I think will be very different from us. That both the technology and the data that sits behind it are going to move on a good few levels. I think in the short term, anything we can do to try and pull that collaboration around what somebody's actually worth, not just what it says in their demographic of their postcode, but the strong KYC stuff that the likes of you guys will do, is how we can add stuff onto that. So the challenge that Steve and his family will have is there's so much data, what does it mean? So there's no answer to that short term, but I do think if we look back in 12 months' time, there'll have been some big changes implemented over the next 6 months.
If I can just pick up on what Steven said as well there, I completely agree. The collaboration on the financial services is pretty key, I would say. What do we know about people at the moment who are struggling financially? So they'll maybe be looking for a mortgage break. They'll be defaulting on lease payments. They'll be applying for credit cards. They'll be applying for loans. They'll be looking for ways to fill the gap in income that they don't have any longer. And if they are gambling when they don't have that money, then that's key information that the gambling industry should and could have. I think that sort of collaboration is absolutely key. I mean, if you were applying for a credit card, the banks wouldn't look at your application without knowing what other applications you'd made for credit elsewhere. And it's a similar thing, I think, to gambling, that sort of information would be and should be critical in these decisions. But Richard and everyone, I hate to be the party pooper, although actually I do love it to be the party pooper. The thing is that collaboration is absolutely, you are all absolutely right on the need and the power of collaboration. The problem is that until this happens, and until if this will happen, the regulators still require some actions to be taken, and we cannot just, default on the lack of collaboration and saying that we don't have the information and we don't have all of the information, and therefore we cannot take any efficient measures. But this is what they still want to see, and rightly today, and back to what would go in the articles to help maybe improve the perception is, okay, taking in consideration the constraints and the lack of information that the operators have or not, what measures did they take? What actions did they do in order to help prevent the harm from the players? Did they, for example, block the bonusing? Did they block the VIP or froze the VIP schemes in terms of expiration time of the points, in terms of the loyalty programs and their encouragement to play more and more? What concrete actions, regardless of the fact that they might not have the full picture of the financial situation of the player, just like the bank doesn't have also the full picture, because bank is a free competition model, and a single player might have various different banks and that are not also sharing the information amongst themselves. At the end of the day, we are going to be investigated and inquired by the regulators into what did you do, and put aside your excuses. What did you do to protect the consumers? And I think that those are the stories that the newspapers, that the general public would like to understand. My points have been frozen with no expiration date. I have not been bombarded with bonuses. I have not been lured into gaming because I was a betting customer. Those are the stories I think that the public wants to hear.
But I think just to clarify, we're not, from an operator perspective, we're not saying that we're not doing any of that just because we're waiting on the banks. And I think that that was an answer very specific to the question asked in terms of how we improve that. Solely talking about affordability, but all of these other initiatives, are business as usual. And I think that's the bit that everyone's missing, is that for someone like William Hill, us to protect our customer is business as usual. It shouldn't be seen as a extra step we have to take all of the time. It should be seen as a business as usual. How we as an operator meet our licensing objectives is in a way that protects our customer, is what we have to do all year round, not just in these type of environments, but also, we are not, we are doing the best possible we can with what's in front of us. Now, if someone asks, how do we improve that? Then there's only so far the industry can go solo, on our own. We need that extra, level of information to ask something specific like affordability. Affordability is very different to responsible gambling. And also it's very different to AML. And I think that sometimes as an industry, we combine all three because we're looking for that, that golden nugget answer that sits out there. They're three different elements, the elements and what you might find in an RG module around gameplay, time of day, players' behavior. It's very different to then an affordability question on what can they afford each month after their salary and bills can they afford to gamble with. But that again only leads us to the question of, there's an element of their salary that they can use to gamble with. However, we don't know what other entertainment or leisure activities they partake in. Therefore, are we always going to be criticized? Because where does that line stop, I guess? And certainly from an operator perspective, we never, we wouldn't walk in with a regulator and start blaming the banks. We're selling what we're doing. We're telling the regulator, we're in constant dialogue with the regulator saying, look what we're doing. But I can't help but saying, if I rung someone up from, I don't know, let's pick if I rung up from a well-known newspaper, I'm not going to name anyone. I'll start getting hate mail or something. But, a well-known newspaper and ring them up and say, come and interview me. Let me tell you exactly what we've implemented at William Hill and how we managed our customers. They're not going to print that. They're going to go back to the cases that suit a wider conversation that sometimes we don't even get a chance to comment on. So, it's not making excuses for what we can't do. We're actually saying this is what we're doing and we think we're working well and we think we're getting to a point that, this is really making an impact now. But the next step would be this, to ensure that we can take this further, because there's always going to be need of that next step. That's never going to stop in something like this. It's never going to say, there's never an end line in something like affordability, because the line will always move. People will constantly change jobs. People, their situations will constantly change. And what we're actually saying is, help us out a little bit so we can make this better, because we think we're doing great. And we think that actually the people we've got on this in the industry who know their products, who understand their market, are the best people to do it. But with a little bit more information, it would be a hell of a lot better.
And I think it just again, obviously proves that, what we've said at the start. I think the operators sometimes are unfairly criticized or picked on the wrong points, because, as you rightly say, drama just sells better than like positive compliance news. And then after that, who's going to open a newspaper and wants to look on the, let's say, the fourth page at, William Hill installed this really, really good responsible gambling system. Again, it doesn't please anyone's brain. I don't know how else to explain that, but it's I guess, the steps that we have to take as an industry, I guess, to be a little bit more upfront about what we're doing, a little bit more upfront about the measures that are being taken.
I don't just think it's just our industry though. You look at anything, if you look at a newspaper or a website, you're going to see the bad news before the good news. Sadly, that's just the world we live in. So, it doesn't just stop with the gambling space. You're going to see, if you take, what's going on at the moment, you're going to see the bad before the good. And I think that it's a reminder that, when you do scroll down properly, when you use the apps and stuff, you go to the sort of second page of headlines, you do start seeing all the good news that's out there. And hopefully this is sort of a jolt for everyone to look at how they, do promote the world, not just gambling, but every other industry, to see there is some good things out there, and maybe we all need to take stock of them sometimes and push them to the forefront. We're certainly as an industry trying to do that. And as Peter said earlier with the BGC messages, that's a totally different tone of voice now. And if we can build upon that, as operators as well, alongside that, I think that we might, slowly start changing that. It's a long road ahead, but I think it's certainly the positive start of something new, a fresh voice, a fresh way of showing the good that happens.
Yeah. I think it's just get those messages and just be consistent, then back it up with facts. Because I think, the unfortunate truth is we're not probably going to get the recognition that we probably deserve for some of the initiatives. So back it up with fact, be consistent with our messages, have a single focal point for the industry, which I think we have now. And then your point, Steve, is it's bit by bit, slowly, we'll start making inroads into that. And I think we've seen positive signs for that at the moment, because all the companies that take that responsible approach are doing the right thing. We need to just be focused on those areas that aren't, and don't judge us all by that. But I think the messages are positive for coming from the weekend.
And I think just on the last point, today is the 14th of April, so I guess a big day for the whole gambling industry. So essentially, from today, all credit cards are essentially forbidden to deposit with. So not allowed anymore to deposit with those. And it's obviously, I guess, great news from a responsible gambling side of things, that people won't be able to use their credit cards to gamble, because at the end of the day, if you cannot afford to gamble, you obviously shouldn't gamble, and that's a big message here. However, I essentially went on to try some things today, and again, we're going to this collaborational side of things from financial services from different providers. And this is not a tip to any gambler, so please don't listen if you are a problem gambler what I'm about to say. But at the end of the day, if you have a credit card behind your Apple Pay account or your PayPal account, you will still be able to deposit money with your credit card, and that's essentially hidden behind those systems. Now, I guess the only way really to ban those credit card payments through different providers is to essentially do a proper collaboration, right? Or is there? Or Stephen, from your side, from William here, is there anything else that you could do to stop the people, depositing those things via Apple Pay or PayPal? Because as far as I'm aware, you are not allowed to see what the payment method was in that transaction, or I think there is no means of way to do it.
Well, a lot of the ways that the reason for PayPal, etc., to the way it works is to protect the consumer's credit card details in a way that point of contact is with PayPal stores the details. We won't truly see the impact of this until obviously probably a few months down the line, how this works out. There's still ways that we know that guys can, and people can move cash balances into their current accounts on their credit cards, stuff like that. So, again, it will come back to if your model is correct in terms of your source of wealth and source of funds, then they will trigger, and then we will obviously pick these customers up. We can't stop someone from moving that money from a credit facility. At that point they've moved it, but we should catch them at a point that our risk-based model allows us to. On our previous podcast, we'll give that a plug here, Roger, when we sat down, and spoke about this, before it was, obviously it came up quite quick on us, is that we mentioned that's just that, we're potentially going to move the problem to black market, payment methods. We could move it to ways of moving money around that lead to people facing more charges. I think one of the biggest, pieces, William Hill did come out and say, this isn't going to answer the problem. It might help some people, but it's not the silver bullet that's going to answer the question. So where does it stop? Where will this stop in terms of that and types of, prepaid accounts, etc., when we can't necessarily see what's being funded the other side? So, as we go through this process, we will see the outputs. It'll be quite easy for operators to tell if there's obviously from today a massive increase in PayPal, or PaySafe cards, or, anything else that operators have, any other e-wallets, for example. That would be pretty easy to see. How we solve that is something that we would have to sit down with the guys, from these companies, and also, understand what the regulator expects from us to do about that. It's certainly not, going to fix problem gambling. It might help some people, and it might enable some people to, not, use credit facilities. Take the overdraft thing with the new charges on overdrafts. I think it's now 40% or something, for overdrafts. How will we know that someone's not using an overdraft and facing that type of charge? The question's endless in that sense. And, I don't think we have enough time to really dive into that, because it's going to go on and on.
But I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I see this as a first big step to essentially, then ensure even more that we follow essentially regulations and guidance around responsible gambling. I mean, Richard, maybe from your perspective, as you are the expert here, I mean, how can we prevent those things in the future, where essentially you have other means of essentially depositing your money from your credit card, or would it have to be literally like a cross regulation across all sectors that would have to be created? I mean, surely you must have had these questions a lot of times from operators, whilst obviously kind of concurring with them about this.
Yeah, I'm very surprised when you said that was the case. You could still pay deposit into an account with Apple Pay and PayPal using a credit card. But I think that was always flagged up as being a potential way around these restrictions. And in the Gambling Commission consultation, that was raised by operators saying, well, there will be ways around this. I've just flicked up the new LCCP, which came into force today. So the LCCP says that licensees must not accept payment for gambling by credit card. This includes payments to the licensee made by credit card through a money service business. And presumably both PayPal and, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but PayPal and Apple Pay would be a money service business in this situation. And therefore the obligation appears under the license, the strict wording of the license condition, to apply to the licensee not to accept payment through one of those payment methods. So there is a significant issue here if that is the case, because operators potentially, without knowing that they are breaching a license condition, could be breaching a license condition by accepting payment from Apple or PayPal.
Well, I mean, obviously a very, a very hot topic, I guess, and I'm sure I'm not the first who's kind of, tried the means and obviously to go through different things. But I mean, as I said before, I mean, there's literally no way how operators can look into that data. Because as Steven obviously said, like PayPal is something that's to protect your essentially, card details from obviously other companies. So, I mean, essentially that would mean that we would have to go in a wider group, I guess. And I mean, from a technology perspective, I mean, as far as I'm aware, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter and Jeremy, I think there isn't a way, even with technology, how you could spot that, because the data that you get from PSPs and obviously MSPs is anonymized, and you can't see what payment method or where that money came from. So, in the end of the day.
So I was just going to think the interesting point there is what Richard just said about, if you read the regulation as it reads there, you shouldn't be allowing it. Whether that's going to be tested by any of the parties involved, but on the face of it, it looks like that would certainly be the case.
Yeah, I don't say this would happen in practice, but in actual fact, if there is a risk to the operator of breaching that condition, then the way to resolve it is to say, until we can be satisfied that those deposits aren't funded by a credit card, that we would cease to take payments by PayPal or Apple Pay. I know that may sound unrealistic.
Yeah, it'd be fascinating to see the numbers. I mean, we tend to get bogged down into the minutiae of it, but does this make a big difference to the industry? I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying it'd be interesting to try and find out how much is funded by that sort of payment. But I guess that's not a conversation for today.
But I think that's the point, is that we won't truly know that, as we go through the weeks of this from today onwards, we'll start seeing that data from an operator perspective of, if there's large increases in certain payment methods, then we will then, work with them payment providers to ensure we are meeting our licensing conditions. How that's done, it'll be different for every operator. Them conversations, have been ongoing and will continue to be ongoing with all of our payment providers to ensure they meet a certain standard, because we wouldn't want to be associated with them from an operator perspective. It's just, until we start seeing that data, we won't truly know the scale of that. And if it will actually be, as we spoke about when the consultation went back, pretty much all the operators did raise that same question: is how are we going to govern this outside of the straightforward credit card, payment? Was always going to be the problem, and it's going to be interesting over the coming months to see, how all of the operators either work together on that or individually adapt to that type of, problem. If it does become a problem, I guess, that it's waiting to see what the figures show us.
So I think that's actually a cool point there. So what I'm going to do is, in the meantime, I'm going to somehow try and investigate on that. So and see what are those actual implications, and we can then essentially come back maybe in 1 or 2 weeks and sit down together. But essentially, obviously, a very interesting point, because in the end of the day, are we going to, in 2023, are we going to see fines being essentially, given out to operators that have accepted an example, Apple Pay in that time? It's obviously, I guess, a very valid question for the future, in terms of, what the UKGC is going to do. So let's see how that pans out. So, we've already been on longer than an hour. As per usual, a lot to talk about. It was a pleasure for obviously having everyone here. So all I can say, gentlemen, is thank you very much for joining. And I hope you stay healthy, stay safe, and stay at home first of all. So that's a message to all: stay home and stay safe. And
appreciate it. Thanks, chaps.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Roger. And I just want to say it's not the same not being face to face. It's nice, but it's not the same.
Yeah. Indeed, I know. Hearing your smoky voice like in front of me just is even more pleasant than here. But it's totally right. But I'm sure we'll we'll do it again soon. So thanks very much for listening. To everyone. So as said, a lot of valid points made here. A lot of interesting topics as always. Thanks very much for listening. And until later.
Thank you for listening to ID Podcast, powered by ID Now. If you like today's content, please make sure to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform and also on YouTube. So for now, thank you and goodbye.